to another adventure in Australian literature. So I'm bringing you something a bit different this week. I'm bringing you a piece of non-fiction. Don't do that very often, but I was thinking about how we've got a video on the Australian Gothic and that's rather popular, and I was thinking, you know what, I'll bring you the book that really brought a very dark, very Australian Gothic story from Australia's history to light. It's a real life Australian Gothic. So, before we start, remember there is our shop where we have books and writing services. There is our Redbubble shop where we have over 100 designs, and if you want to support us, you can support us there. If you want to support us but you don't want us to be spending any money, absolutely fine. Like, comment, subscribe, and share. So, what are we having a look at? We are looking at one of the events that you can't get much earlier than this in terms of white Australian history. We are looking at Hugh Edwards' Islands of the Angry Ghosts. His 1966 book about the wreck of the Batavia off the coast of what is now Western Australia, but back then was known to white people as the Great Southern Land. It was off the coast of Yamatji people's land. The Yamatji people are the peoples of the western deserts around Geraldton, and they are the Amangu people, the Narangaja people, the Wajariya people, and Naranda people, and the Badamina people. So this includes also the Western Desert people known as the Matu people. So these are the only people whose land this was near. There was no white Australia at this point. So these islands that the Batavia wrecked off are off the coast, about 60 kilometres off the coast of the Yamatji people. So this is probably the worst. No, I don't think it's probably. This is the worst, most scary, most horrific maritime disaster that is in Australian history. And this happened in 1629. This is an interesting book. Until 1966, the Batavia was not very well known as a part of Australian history. It was known among divers because it was a wreck that nobody had found yet. It was known among maritime historians, but for the general public, the Dutch contact with Australia was very, very not known. We knew it was that there were maps done by Dirk Hartog and Abel Tasman that called it the Great Southern Land, that called Tasmania Van Diemen's Land. So we knew that this Dutch connection, but basically they mapped Western Australia because they ran into it. And it was bad. It was really bad. Actually, they ran into it at least twice, close together. Once, again, after the Batavia, but not nearly what happened on the Batavia. So, this is old history. This is so old to white Australian history. This predates the English, the British Empire. This predates actually, I think this predates the Act of Union. This predates the English Civil War. The English were nowhere near coming anywhere near their sea dominance when the Dutch East India Company was at the height of, at this huge point in their power, and a massive naval, maritime power in the India and Southeast Asia up to into Indonesia, because what's now Jakarta, it used to be called Batavia. So if you've never heard of this story, and really, unless you're particularly interested in shipwrecks, you probably haven't heard this story. And even if you have heard this story, you probably haven't heard the whole of this story. Or you've got bits and pieces of it. It's sort of a bit folkloric. But it's in 1629, so about 3 years after Shakespeare died, before the Civil War. This is very early. The Batavia, the flagship of the Dutch East India Company, wrecked off the Abruzos Islands. These islands were very shallow islands on a reef, and they're a connected archipelago of very small islands surrounded by a coral reef. The Batavia was the flagship. It was sailing with a group of with other Dutch ships to Indonesia, and it had got separated. Now, that's bad enough. That's bad enough that the flagship of this, the just commissioned flagship, huge ship, enormous expense, gets wrecked on a reef. It ran aground on the reef, it ran aground on high tide, so the shallow water, there was no getting it off, and then it was well and truly stuck. And that's bad enough. What made it worse? What made it worse was that there was a mutiny fermenting on board the ship. Mutineers were planning on taking the ship, killing the passengers, killing whatever crew were loyal to the company, and taking it pirating. It had a vast treasure on board, it had a lot of cannons, and they wanted to take it for themselves. Now, that's bad. That's already happening on ship, on board. The commander, there is the command structure of these is very different to a British Navy vessel. They have a skipper who actually pilots, and then they have a commander, and they call him a commander. He's not a captain. It's kind of unusual. So the skipper is kind of the captain of the boat, but the commander is in charge of the entire endeavour. It's a little bit confusing. It's quite different from a British Navy organisation. But the skipper and the commander did not get along. They were fractious, but the company they had a past, but the company put them both on the ship together to make this voyage out to Indonesia. The commander had hoped to get a desk job back in Holland and had not wanted to go overseas again. He was not very well. He had been ill in India and had returned and hadn't expected to be sent out overseas again so soon. He was sick a lot of the time on board ship, so that wasn't good. And you had this conspiracy happening. And the conspiracy was happening among not the sailors, but the company soldiers. So there are company soldiers on board, many of whom are junior officers. They're aristocratic, and they are getting corrupted by this particular fairly senior member of the company. So, the ship runs aground. Ship runs aground, people flee the ship to these small islands. Everything is, well, it's not great. There's no water, there's no food, or there's very little water. There's very little has been salvaged off here. The troops got into the spirits that were on board and got incredibly drunk, which hampered salvage operations. A lot of things were happening. It was chaos. It was a chaotic evacuation of the ship. The attempts to cut the mast crashed down onto the ship rather than into the sea, which didn't reduce the thing. It was a mess. That's all in this book. Several of the conspirators, plus many other men, stayed on board in the hull of the ship, on board the ship, before the ship actually broke up. It took a while to break up because it was wedged on the sand. The commander plus sailors plus a woman and a baby. Now there are women and children on this ship as well. That's the other thing that makes this really horrific. There are women and children on this ship. The commander and the sailors take a smaller boat and they sail for Indonesia. They actually leave everyone on these islands. They don't know that there is a mutiny being planned, but also the commander really probably should have stayed. Though given the nature of what happened next, he probably wouldn't have helped much at all. But he and sailors leave to go to Indonesia to get to Batavia, or what is now Jakarta, to get a ship to come back and rescue people. Mostly what they need to rescue is the treasure on board. This is the Dutch East India Company after all. They're not really expecting to get a lot of those people back, but they do need to get the treasure back. So the first couple of nights on the island are absolutely horrific. They run out of water. People are starting to die of thirst. This is off the coast of Western Australia. These are arid islands. There is no water source on the island that they are on what is known as the graveyard of Batavia. There's no water source on that island. So they are really suffering, and then it rains and they manage to gather water, get water. As it's the conspirators are still on the boat and they haven't left yet. As the as flotsam and jetsam float in from the disintegrating Batavia, they actually start to get, they've got sails coming in, they've got timber coming in, they've got barrels of food coming in. They start to actually, okay, we can survive. If you survived the first few days of no water, you were going to survive. You were going to survive. They discovered that there are birds, huge numbers of birds on the islands. They use it as a breeding ground, and it happens to be breeding season, so there are lots of eggs. They discover seals. They discover that the fish, having never been caught, take the line really easily, and so they discover that even though there are a lot of people on this island, they can survive. Unfortunately, one of the last people off the disintegrating hull of the ship is the main conspirator. And he comes aboard, he finally drifts onto the island, and he is actually the most senior company man left on the island. And so people look to him as, oh, you'll be our leader. The poor lambs, these poor people, because his fellow conspirators let known, oh, someone let it slip that what we had been planning. We don't know how long we have, because he's not giving up on his mutiny. He wants to hijack the rescue ship. He wants to take the rescue ship. What that follows is murder upon murder upon murder upon murder as the conspirators slaughter as many people as they possibly can, and people flee. There isn't many places to flee to, but they have marooned a group of the soldiers without weapons on another island. Turns out this island has water. And although unarmed, this has the most loyal to the company soldiers on it. These men provide a refuge for anyone who can get to that island. So people flee if they can, and ultimately what happens is the conspirators do manage to kill huge numbers of people. Huge numbers of these survivors get killed by the conspirators brutally, absolutely brutally. They kill a lot of capable soldiers, people who they think are going to oppose them. They maroon a bunch of soldiers. They kill the sick. They kill women. They kill children. They decide, because they had to lower the number of people to feed. Now, this isn't obviously true, because they had been thriving until this psychopath turned up. I mean, the kind of thriving that you can do on a deserted island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. But it wasn't this. It wasn't this. When finally the rescue ship comes with the commander on board, they discover the soldiers trying to defend the remaining survivors and the mutineers attacking. They're warned not to go near them, and they manage to capture the mutineers. This is all the historical record. 7 of the mutineers are killed on the island. They're tried and they're executed on the island. And the others are taken back to Jakarta, Batavia, to be also tried and executed by the authorities in Jakarta. They also, while on this rescue mission, it's also a salvage mission. They've got to try and bring up the trunks of silver that are in the hull. They bring 2 Indian divers from Gujarat, and actually 2 Dutch divers, which is an unusual thing. The Gujarati Indian pearl divers is not an unusual thing, but they do manage to bring up a lot of the treasure. Most of the cases, because they'd all been brought up onto the deck. 2 remained in the hull that they couldn't bring up. One that had been broken open while the soldiers threw silver at each other, and one that was just wedged under something and there was no way of bringing it up. So this was a real story of horror, of what happens when white people end up in the middle of nowhere in Australia and no authority is there to hold life together. It's a real Australian Gothic. It is, and that's the first half of this book. The second half of this book is the story of finding the Batavia, because the Batavia remained lost for, well, it says here 334 years by 1963. So for 334 years, it remained sunk at the bottom of the sea, the bottom of that reef, and nobody knew where it was. And then in 1963, Hugh Edwards, who was a diver, had dived on many archaeological sites, who was also a journalist, discovered he and others with him discovered the actual resting place of the Batavia. It had been thought to be further south in the islands, but along with a historian and the help of local crayfish fishermen and documentary evidence, he found the Batavia. Now, then he put together an expedition which included help from the Navy, who wanted to have a chance to give their divers something to do. They managed to survey and bring up artifacts out of the sunken Batavia. They also found the island known as Batavia's Graveyard, which has had so many of the passengers and crew of the Batavia buried in it from the murders that were carried out there. They managed to find the prison cells, which were made to keep the conspirators in, to find the island where the soldiers defended the remaining people of the who had escaped the conspirators, and the island where the executions had taken place. So it's a really amazing little book, because you get, on one hand, you get this historical story, and then the other side of it, you get this real look into the adventure and excitement and dangers of maritime archaeology. And it is the kind of story that really ignites your imagination. Because when we hear mutiny, and I think that the mutiny part is really important to remember with this, because I think what most people think, oh, the Batavia, the place where they ran aground, they were stuck off Western Australian coast and they killed each other for a while. And it seems more, when you hear the potted history at first, it seems more like, oh, this was just simmering tensions among survivors. And it's like, no, this was far more calculated and vicious and brutal. And it honestly, most people, when you think mutiny and Australia, people think mutiny on the Bounty as like that's the big mutiny, and it's like not really. I mean, it was Bligh, and Bligh managed to have 2 ships and a colony mutiny under him. He got mutinied on the Bounty mutinied under him up in Tahiti, and they then went to Pitcairn Island. Because he was a bit of a cruddy leader. He was apparently a brilliant naval person, but a cruddy leader. He had another ship mutiny under him, and then the British Authority thought, well, what do we do with him? I know, we'll make him Governor of New South Wales. And then the Rum Corps mutinied on him, or rebelled on him, and that didn't go too well either. I think he did put down the Rum Corps mutiny, but everyone sort of knows Bligh as like that guy. So when we think of mutiny, it is sort of, there is a certain sense in Australian history if we think of Bligh and the Bounty and that sort of thing. And it's sort of a bit, he was a bit of a tosser, wasn't he? But the Batavia is so much more vicious. But reading it, I was really struck by the difference between this, which is the Dutch East India Company and the colony of New South Wales, or Sydney Cove, especially Sydney Cove in the very, very early years, the years where the whole thing could have fallen, like everyone could have died and nobody would have been any the wiser, for at least until the next ship turned up. And I think one of the big differences is the difference between the way the Dutch East India Company ran things and the way the British Navy ran things. Because one of the things that is a characteristic of the Navy, of the British Navy at this time. Now, both of these events separated by nearly 200 years. That's how early the Batavia is. 1629 and 1770 is Cook's voyage of exploration when he came down to Australia. He ripped the guts out of the bottom of his ship on the Great Barrier Reef. That's why Cooktown is called Cooktown, because they were stuck there for some time trying to having to repair the Endeavour, because they ripped the guts out of it on the Great Barrier Reef. Not a good thing to do to your ship. Not a good thing at all. But I think one of the big differences there, both of those ships are at the very limits of their technological thing. I mean, getting stuck off the islands of Western Australia and getting stuck off Cooktown, off the southernmost tip of the Great Barrier Reef, is like being marooned on the moon at that point. This was not, this was like Apollo 13 stuff. You are so at the limits that getting back again once things go that badly wrong is remarkable. But I think one of the differences is the company was considering money foremost, and I don't think that they seem to, from reading this, it doesn't appear that they worried particularly about clash of personalities, and they didn't seem to worry terribly about who they were putting in positions of power, because the man who started the conspiracy to mutiny was not the kind of person you would put in a position of power if you were thinking about that. But he was probably a very good company man. Whereas when you look at something like the British Navy, one of the things that made that work, and I'm not saying it was nice because it was brutal, was the discipline. That was one of the big things. That's why Bligh is remembered. We don't remember that many of the captains. We remember Cook. We remember Bligh. We remember Nelson. We don't remember a lot of British naval captains. Bligh because he lost his boat under him. Cook because he went on the big voyage of mapping the Pacific. And Nelson, obviously, because he won the Battle of Trafalgar. But we don't remember a lot of these naval captains. But they were an enormous power because they were disciplined. And I think that was part of what allowed the settlement in Sydney to actually survive, was the discipline. Being stuck in the New South Wales Corps was not necessarily, you were just as exiled as the convicts. This was a pretty brutal system that the British military maintained, and and New South Wales was really a military outpost for a long time. So was Tasmania. The governors were captains. They were members of the military. Everything was done by the military. Order was kept by the military, by the men in red coats, by the New South Wales Corps. But it appears that seemed to hold everything together to a degree. Not this is taking the entire contact with Indigenous people out. This is just how they govern themselves I'm talking about. We're not going over into that part of it, but just the governing themselves. Convicts were also a really interesting group, because you would think of any group that is going to rebel, especially in the early days when they outnumber the people in charge. You would think, oh, surely that would, but it didn't, which is an unusual sort of thing. I mean, many of these people were urban people who the idea of having to leave the small area of civilization was probably pretty daunting. But they were on a sentence. They weren't slaves. And that seems to have been a really important point. In fact, the fact that they weren't slaves is emphasised by the fact that I think it was the second or third fleet. I think it might have been the second fleet. They used slave ships to transport convicts, and so many of the convicts died that they never ever used slave ships again, because convicts were under under the protection of the state. They were convicts, they were prisoners, but they weren't sentenced to death. They were sentenced to transportation and a sentence. And so, because there was a system that seemed to have an impact on the way that worked. Also, the New South Wales was a mixed. It was not a single sex place. It was a mixed sex. There were female convicts and male convicts, and there were free settlers, male and female free settlers. So it was a very different sort of. It was a very interesting sort of world. But at the same time, pirating had massively diminished in the world. So, and you don't really imagine that a lot of British Navy people were going to go and turn pirate. The Dutch East India Company had pretty much folded at that point, or certainly by the early 19th century it had folded, so that wasn't a temptation on the high seas any longer. But it did make me think about that as a very interesting aspect of this. The marine archaeology is really fascinating. It goes into a lot of detail about how this is done, the feelings of these people seeing this stuff that has not been seen for over 300 years, of actually discovering something new, something real, something tangible. That is a really fascinating part of the book, because you sort of think, oh, well, I've got the story of the Batavia wreck. Is there much else to say? And because it's half the book. But no, the actually discovering all these places, the seeing this is not something then confined to just the documents, but this is a real place. You can walk where this happened. You can see where this happened. It's not a vague horror story. This is a real tangible place where real people are buried, where these events actually happen. Because it's the sort of thing. It is a story that is the stuff of nightmares. It is the stuff of, gosh, could that really happen? And yeah, it really happened. So absolutely, if you're interested in very early Australian history, if you're interested in the idea of a Australian Gothic that actually happened, if you're interested in maritime archaeology, check out Islands of Angry Ghosts. Islands of Angry Ghosts by Hugh Edwards. It's very readable. It's also very, very readable. He has a good style. I normally I have a tendency to rag on writers who have a background in journalism because it's a little bit dull, but this one runs along at a good pace. It's detailed enough to get a full story, but not so much that you get bogged down in things, and he gives you a lot of background, which I really appreciated. So if you're interested in that, check out Islands of the Angry Ghosts by Hugh Edwards. And that's all I've got for this week. I believe possibly Her Ladyship is next week. Not sure. Probably. But could be someone else. We never know. All depends. But until then, make sure you have some enjoy some adventures in Australian literature, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.